Never thought I'd become someone who does what I did. But when you see your grandson the way I saw mine, something in you goes quiet in a way that's hard to explain. Not calm. Quiet. Like the part of you that worries about consequences just steps aside. My name's Walt. No, that one's taken. Let me start over. My name's Gil. Gil Mercer. I'm 53 years old, retired electrician out of Knoxville, Tennessee. My wife passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, the only thing that kept me moving was my daughter Alicia and her little boy Cody. He was 5 when we lost his grandmother. By the time this story happened, he was 7. Second grade, missing his 2 front teeth. Loved dinosaurs and hated green beans and slept with a stuffed dog he'd named Captain. Alicia remarried about 18 months after her mother died. I understood it. She was lonely. She was 31, working double shifts at the hospital as a radiology tech, raising Cody mostly alone because his biological father had been out of the picture since before the boy could walk. When she told me she'd met someone, I tried to be glad for her. His name was Trent. He managed a fitness center in West Knoxville, drove a clean truck, had a firm handshake. The kind of man who always seemed to be performing being trustworthy rather than just being it. I didn't say that to Alicia. She was happy. Or she seemed happy. And Cody seemed okay, quiet around Trent. But Cody was a quiet kid in general. First mistake, I told myself quiet was fine. Alicia's custody arrangement with Cody's father, who had resurfaced briefly and then disappeared again, meant she had full legal and physical custody. When she married Trent and they moved into a house in a suburb on the east side, I made a point of visiting twice a month. Trent was always polite to my face, always had a beer ready, always called me sir. But sometimes I'd notice things. The way Cody would look at him before answering a question, like he was checking first. The way Trent would correct him in front of people with this particular flatness in his voice. Not loud, just cold. I mentioned it to Alicia once. She said I was projecting because I didn't like Trent. Maybe she was right. I let it go. Second mistake. I was in the middle of a 2-week job down in Chattanooga, helping a buddy of mine rewire a commercial building. It was a Thursday afternoon in late August. Hottest summer Knoxville had seen in 15 years. That week, temperatures were hitting 97-98 degrees, real heat index in the low hundreds. I'd been planning to drive back up Friday evening and see Cody Saturday morning. My buddy's wife called me at lunch with the name of a good lunch spot nearby, and in the middle of that conversation, I got a text from Cody's school. A reminder about the open house that Thursday evening. Alicia had apparently added me to their contact list months ago, and I'd forgotten. I thought, I'm only an hour and a half away. I can make it back, surprise Cody at the open house, sleep on the couch, be there when he wakes up Friday. I finished the day, drove north, stopped for gas outside Knoxville. I tried calling Alicia to say I was coming. No answer. Texted her. Nothing. I figured she was getting ready, or maybe she and Trent had taken Cody out for dinner first. When I pulled up to their house at 6:40 that evening, Alicia's car was in the driveway, but Trent's truck was gone. The front door was locked. I knocked. Nothing. I tried Alicia again, straight to voicemail. Something felt off. Not alarm bells yet, just the small wrongness of a house that should have had noise coming out of it. I walked around the side. Their backyard was decent-sized, privacy fence, a concrete patio with a gas grill, and along the back fence, one of those pre-built storage sheds. Resin walls, metal roof, about 8 feet by 10. They used it for lawn equipment and holiday decorations. The door had a hasp on it with a combination lock threaded through. A combination lock on the outside of a storage shed door on a 97-degree evening in August. I stood there for a second, just stood there. Then I heard it, a sound so small I almost missed it under the noise of the neighbor's AC unit. A knock. 2 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. Like a pattern, like something a kid would do. I said his name. The knocking stopped. Then, Grandpa? His voice was wrong, thin, hoarse, like he'd been crying for a long time and had run out of sound. I don't remember deciding anything. I remember my hands moving. I found a cinder block near the garden bed, and I hit that lock until the hasp pulled out of the door frame entirely. The screws weren't long enough. I've thought about that since. Trent put that lock on knowing a kid would be inside, and he didn't even bother to do it right. That tells you everything about how much he'd thought through what he was doing. The door swung open, and the heat that came out of it was like opening an oven. Cody was in the back corner, sitting on the floor behind a pushmower. He had on the same clothes he'd worn to school. I knew because I'd seen the photo Alicia texted me Tuesday morning, first day of school, that bright blue shirt with the collar. It was soaked through. His face was flushed dark red, and his lips were dry and cracking, and he was shaking even though it was probably 110 degrees inside that shed. I picked him up. He wrapped his arms around my neck and just held on. "How long?" I asked him. "How long have you been in here, buddy?" He said, "Since yesterday, since after school." Yesterday was Wednesday. It was Thursday evening, more than 24 hours. In that heat. He said he'd knocked on the door so many times his hands hurt. He said he'd drunk all the water from the little bottle Trent had left him, and then he'd been thirsty for a long time. He said he called for his mom, but she never came. He'd wet himself at some point and was ashamed of it, and that broke something open in me that I'm still not sure is closed. I carried him inside through the back door, which wasn't locked, sat him at the kitchen table and got him water, made him drink it slow, got a cold washcloth for the back of his neck. While I was doing this, I heard movement upstairs. Alicia came down the stairs in a bathrobe, eyes unfocused. She saw me and then she saw Cody, and she made a sound I never want to hear again. She said she'd taken some of her sleep medication the night before. Trent had told her Cody was spending the night at a friend's house, a kid named Brady from his class. She hadn't thought to verify it. She'd been working overnight shifts all week and she'd been exhausted. She trusted her husband. I looked at her. I said, "He's been in the shed since yesterday afternoon." The color left her face. She said she hadn't known. I believe her. I believe her now. I believed her then, even when I was furious. Alicia is not a bad mother. She is a woman who trusted the wrong person, and the wrong person used that trust as a weapon against a 7-year-old boy. I called 911. I told them I'd found my grandson locked in an outdoor shed in extreme heat, signs of dehydration. They dispatched an ambulance and a unit simultaneously. Trent came back while the paramedics were still there. He pulled in the driveway, saw the ambulance, walked in the back door, and his expression went through 3 stages in about 2 seconds: surprise, calculation, and then a performance of concern. He said, "What happened? Is everything okay?" And he looked at Cody on the couch wrapped in a cold, wet sheet and said, "Bud, you doing all right?" One of the officers put a hand on his shoulder and walked him outside. The other one stayed with us. Cody was treated for heat exhaustion and moderate dehydration. They kept him in the hospital overnight for observation. His core temperature when they took it in the ambulance was 103.1. The ER doctor told me quietly outside Cody's room that another few hours would have been a different conversation. I sat in that hospital room next to his bed and watched him sleep and counted his breaths for a long time. Trent was arrested and held for processing. Child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment. The DA's office said they had a strong case. Trent's attorney argued it was a disciplinary measure that Trent had lost track of. He'd gotten called in for a shift and hadn't realized how much time had passed. Lost track of time. Left a 7-year-old in a 110-degree shed and lost track of time. Bail was set at $40,000. His parents wired it that evening. I was in the parking lot of the Knox County Courthouse when he walked out. He didn't see me. He was talking on his phone, nodding at whatever the person on the other end was saying, and he looked like a man who'd had an inconvenient afternoon, not a man who'd nearly killed a child. I drove home and sat in my driveway for 45 minutes. I want to be clear about what happened next. I'm not telling you to do what I did. I'm not holding it up as the right answer, but I'm also not going to lie about it and say I regret it, because I've spent a lot of time trying to find the regret, and it isn't there. A week after his release, I started paying attention to Trent's schedule. I know that sounds methodical. It was. I'd spent 30 years doing electrical work. You don't rush through a job, you don't skip steps, and you double-check everything. I applied that to this the same way. He was back at the fitness center. Apparently the arrest hadn't cost him his job yet, which told me his employer either didn't know the details or didn't care. He drove to work at 6:15 in the morning, left between 7:30 and 9 in the evening depending on the day. Thursdays he closed, always the last one out, usually by 9:45. I borrowed a truck from my buddy Earl. Told him I was hauling some equipment. He didn't ask follow-up questions. Earl has known me for 20 years and he trusts me, and I'm sorry I used that. The Thursday, I parked in the shopping center across from the fitness center and waited. Trent came out at 9:38. He was heading toward his truck when I got out and said his name. He looked at me the way you look at something you thought you'd already handled. He said, "I'm not supposed to have contact with your grandson." I said, "That order's about Cody, not you and me." He said he was going to call the police. I said, "Go ahead. Tell them you're alone in a parking lot at night with the grandfather of the child you locked in a shed." He didn't call. Instead he said, "That was an accident." I said, "How many hours?" He said, "What?" I asked him how many hours he'd been in a closed shed on a day that hot. I said, "You know the number. You knew it when you drove away." He didn't answer. He was quiet in the way people are quiet when they're scared, and also calculating, looking for the angle. I could see him deciding whether to run, whether to fight, whether to try to reason with me. He didn't get to decide any of those things. I had a taser I'd bought legally at a sporting goods store in Maryville. I'm not going to dress that up. I'd bought it with intention. I used it. He went down in the parking lot between two cars where there was no camera coverage. I'd checked twice during the week before. I got him into the truck, zip ties on his wrists, tape over his mouth, moving fast and not thinking, which is the only way you can do a thing like that without stopping yourself. I had a location in mind. My brother-in-law had passed 2 years before and left me a piece of property about 40 minutes outside of town. An old equipment lot, a couple of outbuildings, nothing there now, except some rusted farm machinery and a utility shed about the size of a storage unit. I'd been meaning to deal with the property, but hadn't gotten around to it. No neighbors close enough to matter. I put Trent in that shed. Before I closed the door, I told him exactly what I was doing and why. I told him it was going to be 24 hours. I told him that in the first 4 hours, Cody had knocked on the shed door until his knuckles were raw. I told him in the first 8 hours, Cody had started calling for his mother with whatever voice he had left. I told him in hour 12, I wasn't sure how Cody kept going, but he did. I told Trent there was a water bottle inside, 12 ounces. The same size Trent had left for a 7-year-old in a 110-degree shed in August. Then I closed the door. I came back every 3 hours. I'd open a small vent at the top. It was late September by then, nights were cooler, maybe 65 degrees. He was not going to die. That was the line I'd drawn, and I held it. But it wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't supposed to be. Hour 3, he was angry, shouting through the vent, calling me names, threatening charges. I told him what Cody had been doing at hour 3, still knocking, still hoping. Hour 6, he was quieter. He asked me to let him out. He said he understood. I told him what Cody was doing at hour 6, crying without sound anymore, because the sound was gone. Hour 9, he said he had a heart condition. I told him I'd checked his medical records. I hadn't, but he didn't know that, and that I knew he was healthy. He got quiet. Hour 12, he was crying. Actual crying. I told him what Cody was doing at hour 12, based on what the boy had told me in his hospital room while I counted his breaths. He'd stopped calling for his mom. He'd decided nobody was coming. He'd curled up next to the pushmower and started talking to himself, not in sentences, just sounds, a 7-year-old reverting to something smaller than language. When I told Trent that, he broke. He talked for a long time. About Cody. About the other times. Because there had been other times, shorter ones, when Alicia was at work and he'd decided the boy needed discipline. About the first time, when Cody was maybe 20 minutes in the garage after spilling juice on Trent's workout gear, and how that had felt effective, and how it had grown from there because it kept working and nobody stopped him. He talked about his own father, which I didn't ask for and didn't find interesting, though I understood it in a flat way, the same way you understand how a wire short circuits, the mechanism is clear, the result is still a fire. I'd put my phone on a ledge inside the shed at hour 10 with the voice memo app recording. In those last 2 hours, Trent said everything. He said it clearly, unprompted, with no one in the room. His lawyer later argued it was coerced. The DA's office argued he'd been speaking to himself in a locked space and there was no legal coercion on record. The judge took that under advisement for 3 weeks and ruled the recording admissible. At hour 24, I opened the door. Trent couldn't stand up on his own. He wasn't in medical distress. I checked on him, given him water at hour 15 when he stopped responding, but he was diminished in a way I recognized from the hospital photos of my grandson. That same unfocused look, that same careful way of moving like the body had decided to conserve everything. I called 911 from a disposable phone and reported a man needing medical attention at the property address. I drove Trent's truck to a Walmart parking lot 4 miles from the fitness center and left it there. I wiped it down, walked 2 blocks, called Earl to pick me up. I told Earl I'd explain someday. He said okay and didn't ask. Trent was treated at UT Medical Center for mild dehydration and what the discharge summary later described as an acute stress reaction. The recording was pulled from my phone, which the police found at the scene. They traced it to me inside of a week. I'm not particularly good at being a criminal. The detective who came to my house was a woman named Howell. She sat at my kitchen table and asked me questions for about 2 hours. She was calm and thorough, and she looked me in the eye when she asked whether I'd been at the property on the night in question. I told her I'd been there. I told her most of the rest of it too. I'm not going to sit here and claim I was clever or strategic. I was a grandfather who'd done a thing and was going to own it. I was charged with aggravated kidnapping and unlawful restraint. Trent was charged with child endangerment, reckless endangerment, and criminal confinement. Felony counts, all of them. His attorney tried to get the recording suppressed. Twice. Both motions were denied. He took a plea on the 3rd day of trial. 30 months, minimum security, followed by 3 years supervised probation. He is on the Tennessee Sex and Violent Offender Registry. He will never work with children again. He will never be alone with a child again, legally. I understand those terms are only as good as enforcement, but there's something. My charges were handled separately. My attorney argued necessity. I'd found my grandson in a shed at 110 degrees, watched the man who did it walk out of a courthouse on his way to a golf game, and made a choice. The DA offered a deal, 1 year probation, no jail time, no felony record, in exchange for a guilty plea to unlawful restraint. I took it. I don't know if I'd call that mercy or pragmatism on their part. I think the DA had a daughter. Alicia filed for divorce while Trent was in custody. It was final by November. She got the house, which surprised her and didn't surprise me. Trent's attorney had bigger problems to deal with. Cody is 9 now. He has a new therapist he likes, a man named Dr. Sabin, who does a lot of work with kids who've had what the medical file calls acute traumatic confinement experiences. He goes on Tuesdays. He started playing soccer. He still has Captain, the stuffed dog, though he's a little less public about it now that he's in 3rd grade. His smile is the same as it always was, wide and a little crooked and completely without guile. A few months after everything settled, he asked me about it. We were driving back from his soccer game, milkshakes in the cup holder, and he said, "Grandpa, did you do something to Trent?" I kept my eyes on the road for a moment. Cody isn't a kid you can give a halfway answer to. He thinks about things. I said, I made sure he understood what he did to you. I said, I made sure he'd remember it. Cody was quiet for a little while. Then he said, did it work? I thought about Trent in that shed at hour 12. I thought about his voice breaking when I told him about Cody, curled up next to the pushmower, talking to himself in sounds. I thought about the plea deal, the registry, the minimum security cell somewhere outside Nashville. I said, I think so, yeah. Cody nodded like he was filing that away. Then he went back to his milkshake and started telling me about a kid on his team who could juggle a soccer ball 47 times and how that was basically a superpower. I laughed, and it was a real laugh, and that felt important. I see a counselor now too. Her name is Dr. Foss, and she has an office with a lot of plants in it, and she uses a term I've had to look up, moral injury. She says it's what happens when you do something that violates your own framework for right and wrong, even if the reasons seem justified at the time. She says a lot of combat veterans deal with it. First responders. People who've had to make a call with no good options on either side. I wasn't in combat. I was in a parking lot in Knoxville. But she says the mechanism is the same. You cross a line you thought was permanent, and the crossing changes something in the architecture of who you think you are. I don't disagree with her. Something is different in me now. I notice it at odd times, like when I'm doing a job and I have to cut a wire, the moment just before. There's a smallness of hesitation that wasn't there before. I don't think I was a violent man. I'm not sure I'm a violent man now, but I know that I could be given the right conditions, and I know what those conditions look like. That's a thing to carry. What I also carry is this. On a Thursday evening in August, I showed up at my daughter's house unannounced, and Cody was still alive to call out from a shed in the backyard. 5 hours later might have been a different story. The ER doctor told me that. He didn't mean it as a comfort, but I've taken it as one anyway. Some things I want other parents and grandparents to understand. From the other side of this, trust the quiet. When a child goes quiet around an adult in a particular way, not shy quiet, not reserved quiet, but watchful quiet, the kind of quiet that means they are calculating something, that is information. It was information I had and didn't use, and I'll live with that. The system worked, eventually. But eventually is a word with a lot of hours in it, a lot of hot hours in a shed. A lot of knocks on a door that nobody answered. Don't wait for eventually if you can help it. Document what you see. Write it down with dates. Tell someone. Tell more than one person. There were signs I noticed and mentioned once and then let go because I didn't want to cause trouble. Causing trouble, as it turns out, was the entire point. Alicia is doing well. She's been sober from the sleep medication. She'd gotten into a dependency she hadn't fully recognized. For 8 months. She and Cody go on hikes on weekends, something they never did before. She calls me most Sundays. Last week, she called to tell me Cody had scored his first goal in a real game, and that he'd run to find her in the stands before he even finished celebrating with his team. She said he looked like himself again. She said she'd almost forgotten what that looked like, and now she was afraid of forgetting that she'd forgotten, if that made any sense. It made sense to me. The property outside of town, I finally dealt with it. Sold it to a developer last spring. They're putting up a subdivision. I drove past the construction site once, saw the footings going in for about a dozen houses. Families will live there. Kids will grow up in those yards. I don't feel haunted by the place exactly. I feel like I set something down there and left it, and whatever it is, it's buried now under 6 inches of concrete and a new foundation. Maybe that's the closest I'll get to done. Last month, Cody drew me a picture for my birthday. He's not much of an artist. It was stick figures, rough house, lopsided sun. But he'd written at the bottom in his careful 2nd grade print, "You always come. Love, Cody." I have it on my refrigerator. I look at it every morning when I get my coffee. He's right that I came. He doesn't know how close I came to being too late. I've decided he doesn't need to know that. Not yet, maybe not ever. What he needs to know is the part he already put in the drawing. I always come. I keep coming back to the cinder block. The way it was just sitting there by the garden bed, like it had always been there waiting. I didn't plan to use it. I didn't plan any of what happened in those first 60 seconds. I just heard 2 knocks, a pause, 2 more knocks, a 7-year-old's last attempt at a pattern someone might recognize, and my hand started moving before my brain caught up. That's the thing about living with integrity for 53 years. You build a set of reflexes, you learn what you can live with and what you can't, and eventually that knowledge stops being a thought and becomes something faster. When I heard Cody's voice through that shed door, I wasn't deciding anything. I was just moving toward what was right, the same way I've moved toward it my whole life, one step at a time, without a lot of drama about it. Trent made a different kind of calculation. He looked at the 7-year-old boy and saw a problem to be managed, a variable to be controlled. He used the one advantage he had: size, authority, the locked door, and he called it discipline. But there's a difference between discipline and dominance, and the difference is whether the person on the receiving end grows from it or breaks. Cody didn't grow from what Trent did. He curled up next to a lawnmower and started making sounds smaller than words. That's not discipline. That's the result of someone who had no wisdom to offer, choosing force instead. What I've come to understand, sitting across from Dr. E. Foss in that plant field office, is that what I did in that parking lot wasn't just about anger. It was about evidence. I had watched the system move slowly. The arrest, the bail, the smiling attorney, the truck pulling out of the courthouse lot, and I had made a calculation of my own. I decided that Trent needed to understand what he'd done in the only language he'd left me, not because I thought it would fix him, but because understanding sometimes requires being put in the place of the person you hurt. He confessed everything in that shed, not because I threatened him, because for the first time the reality of what he'd done to Cody was the only thing in the room with him. I'm not saying it was right, I'm saying it was true. The part that stays with me is Cody at hour 12, the part I told Trent through that vent, and the part I've never told anyone else in full detail. By hour 12, my grandson had stopped calling for help, not because he gave up hope exactly, but because he'd used everything he had and arrived at a kind of stillness. A 7-year-old finding the bottom of himself and deciding to stay there and breathe until something changed. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of strength that doesn't come from being protected from hard things. It comes from surviving them and still being yourself on the other side. Cody drew me a stick figure birthday card. He wrote, "You always come." He doesn't know how close the margin was. He doesn't need to yet. What he needs to know is that the people who love him show up, that the world can be trusted. Not because bad things don't happen, but because there are people willing to move toward the sound. I always come. That's the only promise I've ever made that I intend to keep until I can't anymore.